It is past midnight. You know this. Your body knows this. The room is quiet. The rest of the house has gone still. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a reasonable voice is saying that you should close the screen, turn off the light, and let the day end. And yet you don't. You scroll a little further. You watch one more thing. You sit in the particular silence of late night and feel, strangely, more like yourself than you have all day. No one needs anything from you right now. No messages require a response. The morning, with everything it carries, has not arrived yet. You are in the gap between one day and the next, and something in you wants to stay there. The question is not whether you are tired. You are tired. The question is, what are you not ready to let go of? To understand why we resist sleep, it helps to understand what night used to be. For most of human history, darkness was not the enemy of rest. It was not something to fight against with screens and artificial light, and the quiet determination to stay conscious a little longer. It was simply the end of the day, arrived naturally, accepted without much negotiation, and filled in its own way, before electricity, before the long reach of artificial light into every corner of human life. The rhythm of a day was set by something no one controlled. The sun rose. People worked, moved, built, harvested, spoke to each other. The sun set, and the world became dark in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine now. A deep, total darkness that made most activity impractical and rest not just sensible, but necessary. But here's something that often gets lost in that picture. Research into pre-industrial sleep patterns suggests that people did not simply fall asleep at sunset and wake at dawn. There was frequently a period in the middle of the night, sometimes called the first and second sleep, where people would wake, lie quietly, think, pray, speak softly to whoever shared their space. A natural interval of wakefulness, unhurried and unscheduled, sitting inside the larger darkness. Night, in other words, had texture. It was not only sleep, it contained a kind of free time, ungoverned, unproductive, belonging to no one's agenda. A space where the obligations of the day had genuinely ended and the obligations of the next day had not yet begun. This matters because it tells us something about a need that has always existed. The need for time that is truly your own. Time that is not in service of anything, not a task, not a role, not someone else's expectation of you. Time where you exist simply as a person rather than as a function. In that older world, night provided this naturally. The darkness itself enforced a kind of pause. You could not work effectively. You could not travel safely. The world asked nothing of you because the world could not reach you. A farmer at the end of a long harvest day, lying awake in the quiet interval between first and second sleep, was not procrastinating. He was not avoiding anything. He was simply inhabiting a space that the structure of his life had built in, a natural gap where being alive required nothing in particular. He did not have to steal that time. It was already his. This is the origin point, not a disorder, not a modern problem, but a deeply human relationship with the night, an understanding older than any alarm clock or work schedule. That darkness carries within it a particular kind of freedom, a permission to stop performing, stop producing, stop being useful, to simply be present in a quiet world that, for a few hours, is not asking anything of you. What changed was not the need. What changed was everything around it. The world got brighter, and somehow that made everything harder. When Thomas Edison's electric light became widely available in the late 19th century, it did not simply extend the day. It dissolved the boundary that had always existed between time that belonged to work and time that belonged to the self. Suddenly, darkness was no longer a natural stopping point. Factories could run through the night. Offices could stay open. The logic of productivity, which had always been limited by the setting sun, now had no obvious ceiling. And so the day stretched, not in a way that gave people more freedom, but in a way that gave obligation more room to expand. Working hours lengthened. The structure of modern life slowly filled every available hour with something that needed to be done, somewhere to be, something to perform or produce or respond to. Daytime, which had once contained both work and rest in a rhythm set by nature, became almost entirely claimed. Mornings belonged to preparation. The working hours belonged to employers, deadlines, responsibilities. Evenings are quickly swallowed by the tasks that didn't fit into the day, the meals to prepare, the children to settle, the messages that arrive while you were busy with other messages. By the time night arrives, something has already happened. Not a decision exactly, more like a slow accumulation. A person who has moved through an entire day in service of other people's needs, other systems' demands, arrives at midnight with a particular feeling sitting quietly in their chest, a feeling of not yet having had a moment that was genuinely, uncomplicatedly theirs. A woman finishes the last of the evening tasks, the dishes, the homework helped with, the emails briefly checked. The house is quiet, her family is asleep. She sits down on the sofa and picks up her phone. Not because she is looking for anything specific, because this, right now, is the first moment all day that no one has needed her to be anything in particular, and she is not ready to give it up to sleep. She is not being irresponsible. She is responding to something real, the experience of a day that left no space for her. This is how night became the last remaining territory. Not through any conscious rebellion, but through simple subtraction. Remove free time from the morning, obligations. Remove it from the afternoon, work. Remove it from the evening, domestic life, digital life, the long tail of a day that never quite ends. What remains is the hours after midnight. And those hours, precisely because they are impractical and dark and unwatched, retain something the rest of the day has lost. They feel, against all logic, like freedom. Psychologists have a term for this now: revenge bedtime procrastination. The word revenge is important. It suggests that something was taken, that the late-night hours are not simply enjoyed but reclaimed, pulled back from a day that gave too little and asked too much. The night did not change. What changed was everything that came before it. And when daylight hours belong entirely to obligation, darkness becomes the only place left to be a person. But here's what we don't say out loud, my friends. We tell ourselves we stay up late because we are enjoying the quiet, because we finally have time for ourselves, because the night is peaceful and the world is still, and this is the 1 hour in the day that belongs to no one but us. And part of that is true. But underneath it, if you sit with it honestly, there is something else, something less comfortable, because the night is not just the last part of today. It is also the last barrier before tomorrow. And tomorrow, for many people, is not something they are moving toward with ease. Think about what happens the moment you close your eyes, the moment you allow sleep to come. The night ends, and what follows the night is a morning, an alarm, a list, a set of demands that begin almost before you are fully conscious. A day that will ask you, again, to be productive and present and responsive and useful. A day that looks, from where you are sitting right now, very much like the one that just finished. Staying awake is, in this sense, a way of holding the morning at a distance, not the morning itself, the light, the coffee, the particular stillness of early hours. But what the morning represents, the resumption of a life that may feel, if you look at it too directly, like something you did not entirely choose, the job that drains more than it gives, the routine that repeats without reward, the quiet sense that the days are moving past faster than you intended, and that the things you actually want are always waiting somewhere just beyond the current obligation. Sleep is a form of consent. When you lie down and close your eyes, you are agreeing that today is finished, and that tomorrow is allowed to begin. And for some people, in some seasons of life, that agreement is genuinely hard to make. A man lies in bed, phone in hand, not watching anything in particular. He is scrolling without really seeing. He knows he should sleep. His body has been telling him this for 2 hours. But every time he moves toward putting the phone down, something pulls him back. Not excitement. He is not even enjoying what he is looking at. Something quieter than that. A reluctance. A resistance to the act of ending the day. Because ending the day means beginning the next one. He is not lazy. He is not undisciplined. He is postponing something that feels, on some level, like a small surrender. And this is the hidden cost that lives inside all those late nights. Not just tiredness, though the tiredness is real and accumulates and extracts its own quiet price, but something more subtle. A life lived in a low-grade state of avoidance. Days gotten through rather than lived. Nights burned not because they are full of something good, but because they delay something unwanted. The freedom of the late night begins to hollow out. What felt like reclaimed time starts to feel like borrowed time. Hours taken from tomorrow's energy to pay for tonight's brief sense of relief. You stay up to feel like yourself. But the tiredness that follows makes it harder to be yourself the next day, which makes the next day harder to face, which makes the following night harder to end. The pattern feeds itself, and at the center of it, quietly, is not a love of night at all. It is a life that somewhere stopped feeling like it was moving in the right direction, and a person who found in the dark and the quiet and the space between one day and the next, the closest thing available to a pause. You are not the only one sitting in the dark. This is perhaps the most quietly reassuring thing about all of this. The person who cannot put the phone down at midnight, who watches the clock move from 11 to 12 to 1 without making any real decision to stay awake, that person is not unusual. They are not failing at something everyone else has figured out. They are part of something remarkably widespread and remarkably consistent across very different kinds of lives. Studies on sleep behavior in modern populations consistently show that people are sleeping later and less than any previous generation on record. Across dozens of countries, average bedtimes have shifted significantly toward midnight and beyond, not because of any single cause, but because the conditions that produce late nights have become the default conditions of modern life. Long working hours, persistent digital connectivity, the structural disappearance of genuine downtime, these are not personal failures. They are the architecture most people are living inside, and the people most affected are not, as the stereotype might suggest, young people with no responsibilities. They are frequently people in the middle of demanding lives, parents, professionals, caregivers, people whose days are so thoroughly occupied by the needs of others that the late hours become by simple elimination the only time that functions as their own. The term revenge bedtime procrastination, which researchers began using more widely in recent years, resonated with millions of people almost immediately upon entering common conversation, not because it explained something new, but because it named something already deeply familiar, something people had been doing for years without having a way to describe it. The recognition was almost physical. Yes, that is exactly what this is. A nurse who works long shifts sits in her kitchen at 1 a.m, drinking tea she doesn't particularly need, watching a show she has already half seen. She is not procrastinating in the ordinary sense, avoiding a task she should be doing. She is procrastinating on sleep itself, on the act of closing the day. Because the day, however exhausting, was never quite hers. And this hour, impractical, unnecessary, slightly guilty, is the closest she gets. She will be tired tomorrow. She knows this with complete certainty. She will feel it in her body before the alarm is finished sounding. And still, tonight, she does not move toward bed, because the tiredness is tomorrow's problem. And tomorrow is exactly what she is not ready to face yet. This is the normalization that matters, not the reassurance that staying up late is harmless because the costs are real, but the recognition that the behavior makes a kind of sense, that it is not random, not simply weakness, not a failure of discipline. It is a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation, a life so fully scheduled that the only free time available is time that should, technically, belong to sleep. The night did not become a refuge by accident. It became a refuge because everything else was taken. And until that changes, until days contain enough space for a person to actually inhabit them, the lights will keep burning past midnight, in house after house all over the world. So here we are, together, in the quiet end of something. And I want to sit with a question that has been underneath all of this, without quite being asked directly. Now, why we stay up late, we understand that now. But what it means, what it says about a life, and about the kind of lives we have built for ourselves, that so many people find the night to be the only hour that feels genuinely free. Because if you think about it, sleep is one of the most natural things a human being can do. It requires nothing. It costs nothing. It is the body's oldest request, older than language, older than any system we have built around the hours of a day. And yet, for so many people, it has become something to resist, something to delay, a door they stand in front of, hand on the frame, not quite ready to walk through. That is worth pausing on, not with judgment, but with real curiosity. What does it mean to be afraid of your own tomorrow? Not in a dramatic sense, not with dread or despair, but in that quiet, low-level way that looks, from the outside, like someone simply enjoying a late night. The reluctance that lives in the scrolling, in the one more episode, in the tea made at midnight for no particular reason. That reluctance is not laziness. It is information. It is the self, speaking in the only language available at that hour, the language of not yet, not yet, not yet. There is a philosophy, old and simple, that says the quality of a life can be measured not by its grand moments, but by how a person feels on an ordinary Tuesday morning, whether they wake with something resembling willingness, whether the day ahead feels like something they are moving toward or something they are bracing for. By that measure, the late night is a kind of quiet verdict, not a permanent one, not a condemnation, but a signal worth hearing, a way the self has of saying something in the shape of this life is not quite fitting. The days are not leaving enough room. Something that matters to me is not getting enough space. The night, in that sense, is not the problem. It is the messenger, and the question it is always asking underneath the scrolling, underneath the stillness, underneath the strange peace of being awake when the rest of the world has gone quiet, is whether the life waiting on the other side of sleep is one you actually want to return to. That is not always an easy question. Sometimes the honest answer is complicated, or incomplete, or simply, not yet. But I'm working on it, and that is fine. Most real answers are somewhere in that territory. But the first step toward anything better is hearing the question clearly. Not dismissing the late nights as a bad habit to correct, but understanding them as something more honest than that. A person sitting in the dark, holding a few hours of genuine selfhood close, because the daylight hours have not yet learned to hold it for them. You deserve days that don't need to be escaped. You deserve mornings that don't feel like something closing in. And until those days arrive, or until you find a way to build them, the night will keep offering what it has always offered. A space between. A pause. A few quiet hours where the world is still and no one is asking anything, and you are, for just a moment, simply here. There is nothing shameful in needing that. There is only the hope that one day you won't need to steal it from your sleep. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.